In 1923, a Polish grandmother in Chicago fed her husband and 5 children breakfast every single morning for less than 9 cents. 9 cents. She used a cast iron skillet, a wood stove, and ingredients she'd carried in her memory across an ocean. Her granddaughter, interviewed decades later, said the kitchen always smelled the same. Every morning, the same smell, the same sounds, the same food on the same plate at the same time. Before the factory whistle, before the children left for school, before the day had any chance to go wrong. That breakfast is number 7 on this list. Number 14 was so common in Italian immigrant neighborhoods in New York and Philadelphia that bakeries kept their day-old bread specifically for the mothers who came in before 6 in the morning to buy it cheap. Number 3 was brought from Eastern Europe in a cloth sack tucked inside a trunk, and never written down in any recipe book, because nobody who made it thought it needed writing down. These 20 breakfasts were not invented in America. They were carried here, in memory and habit, in the hands of women who had learned them from their own mothers in villages that most Americans cannot find on a map. They crossed the Atlantic. They survived tenement kitchens and coal stoves in Depression winters, and then, within a single generation, they vanished. Not because they were bad. Because someone convinced the next generation that opening a box was the same as cooking. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 20 dirt-cheap breakfasts immigrant grandmothers made every morning, and what we lost when we forgot them. Number 20, rye bread and chicken schmaltz. In Jewish immigrant households from the lower east side of Manhattan to the immigrant neighborhoods of Chicago and Detroit, chicken schmaltz, rendered chicken fat, slow-cooked with onions until golden and deeply savory, was the spread that replaced butter on mornings when butter cost too much. A thick slice of day-old rye bread, spread with a generous spoonful of schmaltz, still warm from the jar, sprinkled with salt, and sometimes topped with a slice of raw onion. That was breakfast. That was how a garment worker or a peddler started a 12-hour day in 1910. Chicken schmaltz cost almost nothing because it was a byproduct of cooking, rendered from the fat of chickens already being used for Friday night soup. The bread was purchased day-old from the bakery for half price. The onion came from a sack that lasted 2 weeks. The fat content was extraordinary, dense, warming, sustaining in the way only rendered animal fat can be. The rye bread provided slow-burning carbohydrate that kept a man standing at a sewing machine or pushing a cart through winter streets until noon without his energy collapsing. Modern chefs now sell schmaltz at $14 a jar in specialty food stores and call it a rediscovered ingredient. The Jewish grandmothers of the Lower East Side made it every week from chicken trimmings and never once thought it needed rediscovering. It was just the fat in the jar by the stove. It was just breakfast. Number 19, polenta with milk. In the northern Italian immigrant communities of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and the mining towns of the Mountain West, polenta was not a side dish. It was not a restaurant appetizer. It was breakfast. Thick, plain, stirred slow in a heavy pot, served in a bowl with cold milk poured over the top. Coarse ground cornmeal cooked in salted water for 40 minutes. Stirred constantly with a wooden spoon until it pulled away from the sides of the pot in a smooth, dense mass. Ladled into bowls while hot. Cold milk poured over to thin it and cool it enough to eat quickly before the workday began. A pound of coarse cornmeal cost 4 cents in 1915. A quart of milk delivered to the tenement doorstep cost 19 cents and served the whole family. The complete breakfast for 5 people cost less than a quarter. Mothers who made this had made it in Veneto and Lombardy and Piedmont before they ever saw America. The ingredient was the same: coarse ground corn, slow-cooked, stirred without stopping. The bowl was different. The stove was different. The street outside the window was different. But the spoon moving through the pot made the same sound it had always made, and the kitchen smelled the same it had always smelled. And for the 40 minutes it took to cook, the ocean between here and there was smaller than it felt the rest of the day. Number 18, bread soup, zuppa di pane. Italian grandmothers did not throw away stale bread. They did not throw away anything. But stale bread, specifically, had a purpose so clear and so established that letting it go to waste would have been a kind of moral failure. Day-old bread, the harder the better. Torn into rough chunks, dropped into a bowl covered with hot water or weak broth, allowed to soften for 3 minutes, then drizzled with whatever olive oil remained in the bottle and sprinkled with salt. That was breakfast. That was how Southern Italian immigrant families in New York and New Jersey started their mornings when the week was tight and the paycheck was still 4 days away. The bread absorbed the liquid and swelled into something between a porridge and a soup, warm, filling, soft enough to eat without effort, requiring no cooking beyond boiling water. The olive oil, even a thin drizzle, transformed it from something that tasted of necessity into something that tasted of home. Bread in Italian immigrant households was never wasted because bread in the villages they came from had never been wasted. The discipline crossed the Atlantic with them, survived the tenement years, and only began to fade when their grandchildren grew up in houses with enough money to throw things away without thinking about it. That is when the bread soup disappeared. Not when the bread stopped going stale. when the grandchildren stopped remembering what stale bread was for. Number 17, kasha with butter. In Russian, Ukrainian, and Eastern European Jewish immigrant households, kasha, toasted buckwheat groats, was the breakfast grain that wheat could not replace. Buckwheat groats toasted dry in a pan until they turned fragrant and nutty, then cooked in salted water until each grain swelled and separated, then served in a bowl with a small pat of butter melted over the top, and, if the week had been good, a soft-boiled egg placed alongside. That was breakfast in a Ukrainian immigrant household in Cleveland or Pittsburgh or Buffalo in 1920. A pound of buckwheat groats cost 6 cents and produced enough breakfast for a family of 4 for 3 mornings. The butter was rationed, a small amount enough to melt into the hot grain and carry the flavor through every bite, without using enough to matter to the household budget. The toasting step, dry pan, medium heat, constant stirring until the groats turned golden, was the step that non-immigrants skipped when they tried to cook kasha, and could not understand why it tasted wrong. That toasting step developed a nutty, almost roasted flavor that made buckwheat taste complex and satisfying rather than plain and medicinal. Immigrant grandmothers knew this without being told. Their grandchildren, who grew up eating cereal from boxes, never learned it. The knowledge died with the generation that carried it across the ocean. Number 16, fried bread with jam. In Irish immigrant households from Boston to New York to Chicago, fried bread was the breakfast that required nothing new, only bread going stale in a pan with a little fat in the bottom. Day-old soda bread or plain white bread, sliced thick, fried in a pan with a spoonful of lard or bacon dripping until golden on both sides, served with a smear of whatever jam was in the jar. Blackcurrant if available, apple jelly if not, nothing at all if the jar was empty. The frying changed the bread entirely. The outside crisped into something crackling and golden. The inside stayed soft and warm, the starch slightly changed by the heat of the fat into something sweeter and more complex than plain toast. The jam cut through the richness of the fried surface and made the whole thing taste like a treat, rather than a way to use up bread that was going hard. Irish immigrant families in 1915 made this because they had bread going stale and fat from the week's cooking and jam put up in summer from whatever fruit grew in the yard. They made it because it took 5 minutes and fed everyone and tasted better than plain bread. They made it because their mothers had made it. They made it until their daughters grew up and bought a toaster and decided that was the same thing. It is not the same thing. Here is what nobody says about immigrant food in America. The women who made these breakfasts were not cooking poor. They were cooking with precision developed over generations, in places where winter was real and hunger was real, and the distance between enough and not enough was measured in tablespoons, not pounds. They came from villages in Poland and Italy and Ukraine and Ireland and Greece and China, where you did not waste the water you boiled vegetables in, where you did not throw away fat from cooking, where bread going stale was not a problem but a resource waiting to be used correctly. They brought that precision to tenement kitchens in New York and factory towns in Pennsylvania and mining camps in Colorado. And in those kitchens, with those same habits, they fed their families better on less money than almost anyone around them. The food companies that replaced their breakfasts did not replace them with something more nutritious. They replaced them with something more profitable. Boxed cereal costs 12 times what oatmeal costs per serving. The advertising told immigrant grandchildren that the box was modern and their grandmother's skillet was old-fashioned. The skillet fed people better. It just could not buy a television commercial. Number 15, Greek paximati and olive oil. In Greek immigrant households in New York, Baltimore, and the textile mill towns of New England, paximati, hard twice-baked barley or wheat bread, dried until it could survive months without spoiling, was the breakfast that crossed the Atlantic without changing a single ingredient. A piece of paximati soaked briefly in cold water until the surface softened just enough to eat, then drizzled with olive oil and sprinkled with dried oregano or salt. Sometimes a slice of tomato when the season allowed. Sometimes a crumble of feta if the week had been good. The base, the hard bread, the olive oil, the water soak, stayed the same regardless. Paximati cost almost nothing because its very purpose was economy. Bread baked twice until all moisture was gone, making it last indefinitely without refrigeration, requiring no storage beyond a dry shelf. Greek sailors had carried it across the Mediterranean for centuries. Greek immigrants carried it across the Atlantic and continued eating it on mornings when the American breakfast felt like it belonged to someone else. The olive oil was not a luxury. In Greek immigrant households, olive oil was infrastructure, purchased in tins, used sparingly but consistently, the fat that made everything taste of where they came from. A tin cost 40 cents in 1920 and lasted 2 weeks. Per breakfast, the cost was less than 2 cents. Number 14, Italian day-old bread with espresso. In Italian immigrant neighborhoods in New York and Philadelphia, the bakeries opened at 5 in the morning and sold yesterday's bread at half price starting at 5:30. The mothers who appeared at that hour, before their children woke, before their husbands left for work, were not buying inferior bread. They were buying exactly what they needed. Day-old Italian bread, slightly stiff, torn into chunks, and dunked directly into a bowl of strong espresso or dark coffee with a little milk. Caffè latte made in a stovetop mocha pot that cost 60 cents and lasted 20 years. The bread softened in the coffee, absorbing the bitterness and the warmth, becoming something entirely different from what it had been the day before. Children ate this at the kitchen table while mothers stood at the stove. In the village in Calabria or Sicily they had come from, breakfast was often nothing at all. You ate when there was something to eat. In America, there was coffee and bread every morning without exception. That was what America meant in a southern Italian immigrant kitchen in 1918. Not wealth, not luxury. Coffee and bread every morning, guaranteed. The mocha pot still sits in Italian-American kitchens across the country. The day-old bread ritual has almost entirely disappeared, replaced by packaged bread that stays soft for 10 days through chemical preservation and costs 3 times as much. Progress, they called it. The grandmothers would have called it waste. Number 13, Chinese congee. In the Chinese immigrant communities of San Francisco, New York, and the railroad towns of the American West, congee, rice cooked in 5 times the normal amount of water until the grains broke down completely into a thick, silky porridge, was the breakfast that required almost nothing and produced something extraordinary. A small amount of leftover rice, or a fresh measure of the cheapest broken rice available, simmered in water for 40 minutes until the grains dissolved into a porridge so smooth and neutral it could accept any topping without fighting it. A preserved egg, a strip of dried fish, a spoonful of soy sauce, a few drops of sesame oil. Nothing at all. The congee itself cost almost nothing. A cup of broken rice, the fragments left over from milling, sold at a fraction of whole grain price, produced enough congee to feed 3 people. The toppings were whatever was in the kitchen. Chinese immigrants working in laundries and restaurants in San Francisco in 1900 ate congee every morning because it was the breakfast their mothers had made, their grandmothers had made, their great-grandmothers had made. It required no translation. It required no new ingredients. It required only water, rice, heat, and time. The American food industry never figured out how to package congee profitably. It takes too long. It cannot be rushed. It cannot be freeze-dried or powdered into something that reconstitutes in 60 seconds. So it was never advertised, never pushed, never positioned as something modern Americans should eat. It quietly survived in Chinatowns across the country and in the kitchens of families who refused to forget it. Everyone else moved on to cereal and never knew what they were missing. Number 12, German bread and quark. In German immigrant households from Milwaukee to St. Louis to the Texas Hill Country, quark, a fresh soft cheese made by straining soured milk through cloth until it thickened into something between yogurt and cream cheese, was the spread that went on dense, dark bread every morning. Soured milk was left in a warm spot overnight until it thickened and separated. The liquid whey drained through a cheesecloth. What remained was quark, a white, slightly tangy, smooth, protein-rich, spread on a slice of dark rye or pumpernickel bread with a scrape of butter underneath and a sprinkle of salt. It was breakfast. In summer, a radish sliced thin on top. In winter, nothing but the cheese and the bread. German immigrant families made quark at home because buying fresh cheese was expensive and souring milk was free, a byproduct of milk that had been bought earlier in the week and had not been used quickly enough. Nothing was thrown away. The sour milk became quark. The whey was given to the pig or added to bread dough. Every part of every ingredient completed a purpose. Today, artisanal quark sells for $8 a container in specialty grocery stores. German grandmothers in Milwaukee made it from milk that was about to turn in a cloth hung over a bowl in the kitchen for free. The ingredient was patience. That ingredient has become expensive. Here's what happened to these breakfasts and why it matters. Between 1945 and 1965, the American food industry invested billions of dollars in a single message directed at immigrant families and their American-born children, that the food of the old country was the food of poverty, and that the food of the supermarket was the food of success. They were not subtle about it. Magazine advertisements showed smiling modern women opening boxes and cans, while the implication hung in the air that the woman stirring a pot at 5 in the morning, who spoke with an accent and shopped for day-old bread, was the past. The woman with the cereal box and the electric toaster was the future. It worked. It worked completely. Within a single generation, the daughters of the women on this list stopped making their mothers' breakfasts. They bought cereal. They bought packaged bread that stayed soft for 2 weeks. They bought instant oatmeal in individual packets and orange juice in wax cartons and called it a modern breakfast. The grandmothers watched this happen and said very little. They had survived too much to argue about breakfast, but some of them kept making their own food quietly in their own kitchens, for themselves, long after everyone else had switched. And the neighbors who knew where to find them sometimes knocked on the door and asked for a bowl of congee, or a piece of bread with schmaltz, or a serving of kasha, because the body remembers what it was fed when it was young, and what it was fed was better than what replaced it. Number 11. Polish Żurek, sour rye. Soup. In Polish immigrant households in the steel towns of Pennsylvania and Ohio, Żurek, a sour soup made from fermented rye flour starter, appeared on the breakfast table in a way that made American neighbors look twice through the window and shake their heads. Soup for breakfast. In America. In 1925. The rye starter, flour and water fermented over several days until sour and slightly fizzy, was stirred into a pot of broth with a boiled egg, a slice of kielbasa or white sausage, and sometimes a boiled potato. The result was tart, warming, deeply savory, and sustaining in a way that no bowl of cereal has ever managed to be. Polish steelworkers who ate Żurek for breakfast before a 12-hour shift at the furnace did not get hungry until well past noon. The fermented base provided probiotics. The egg provided complete protein. The sausage provided fat and sodium that men sweating through brutal heat could not afford to lose. The soup for breakfast tradition died with the generation that had brought it. Their children ate oatmeal. Their grandchildren eat yogurt parfaits. None of them have ever started a winter morning the way their great-grandmothers did, with something hot and sour and deeply nourishing that tasted like Poland in a bowl on a Pittsburgh street at 6 in the morning. Number 10. Norwegian flatbread with butter and brown cheese. In the Norwegian immigrant communities of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas, flatbread, crisp, paper-thin rounds of rye and barley flour baked until they shattered when bent, was the bread that lasted all winter in a cool pantry without spoiling. A piece of flatbread spread with butter and topped with a shaving of brunost, Norwegian brown cheese made from the whey left after regular cheese production, cooked down until the sugars caramelized into a sweet, fudge-like block, was breakfast in a Norwegian farmhouse in Minnesota in 1910, and it was perfect. Brunost cost almost nothing because it was made from whey that would otherwise have been discarded. The flatbread kept for months. The butter came from the farm or was purchased in bulk. The entire breakfast cost 3 or 4 cents and required no cooking beyond the bread that had been baked in a batch on Sunday. Norwegian immigrant women baked flatbread once a week in large quantities, stacked it in a cool place, and ate it all week without any preparation beyond bringing it to the table. That efficiency, one morning of baking producing 7 mornings of bread, was so sensible that it defies explanation why it disappeared. It disappeared because Wonder Bread was softer and required no baking and cost only a few cents more per loaf. The efficiency of never having to bake overcame the efficiency of baking once for a week. The grandchildren chose soft bread. The flat bread went with the grandmothers. Number 9, Hungarian Lexo on bread. In Hungarian immigrant households in the industrial cities of Ohio and Pennsylvania, Lexo, a thick stew of peppers, tomatoes, and onions cooked down in lard until they collapsed into a rich paprika-scented paste, was made in large batches in summer and preserved in jars to last through winter. Spread cold from the jar onto thick bread on a winter morning, Lexo tasted of August and January, of peppers and tomatoes that had been summer warm when they were picked, concentrated by long cooking into something so intensely flavored that a thin spread on a slice of bread was enough to carry a man through a morning in a factory. A jar of Lexo cost almost nothing to produce because peppers and tomatoes were grown in every Hungarian immigrant family's backyard garden. The paprika came from Hungary, purchased at the Hungarian grocery in quantities that made the jar last months. The lard was rendered at home. This was the breakfast of the preserved garden. Summer's abundance converted into winter's fuel, carried through the cold months in glass jars on a cellar shelf, opened 1 spoonful at a time to make February taste like it had not entirely won. Number 8, Greek trahanas soup. In Greek immigrant households, trahanas, a dried fermented grain and milk product shaped into rough crumbles and stored in cloth sacks, made a breakfast soup that required nothing beyond hot water and patience. A handful of trahanas crumbles dropped into boiling salted water or weak broth, stirred for 15 minutes until they dissolved into a thick, slightly sour porridge, a drizzle of olive oil on top, sometimes a crumble of dried cheese, sometimes nothing. Trahanas lasted for years in a dry place. It required no refrigeration. It needed no fresh ingredients. And the fermentation process that produced it, grain and soured milk mixed together, dried in the sun, broken into pieces, created a food so nutritionally complete that Greek shepherds had survived on it as their primary protein source for centuries, before anyone had a word for what made it work. Greek immigrant women brought trahanas in their trunks, the way other people brought jewelry, because trahanas, in a country where the winter was hard and the money was uncertain, was more valuable than jewelry. You could not eat jewelry at 6 in the morning before your husband left for the factory. Number 7, Polish kajamana with butter and sugar. The grandmother in Chicago, the 9-cent breakfast. This is it. Semolina, the pale, fine-ground wheat flour sold cheaply at every grocery in the immigrant neighborhoods of Chicago, cooked in milk or water until it thickened into a smooth, creamy porridge. served in bowls with a pat of butter melting in the center and a spoonful of sugar sprinkled over the top. Kasha manna, Polish semolina porridge. Made every morning for decades in a Polish immigrant household on the northwest side of Chicago, so consistently that the daughter interviewed 60 years later could describe the sound of the spoon on the pot without being asked. A pound of semolina cost 7 cents in 1923. Milk was 19 cents a quart. The butter was rationed to a small pat per bowl. The sugar was a quarter teaspoon. Enough to sweeten, not enough to waste. The entire breakfast for 6 people cost less than 9 cents. It was warm. It was filling. It tasted of care because the same hands made it the same way every morning without variation. That consistency, that reliability was what the grandmother in Chicago gave her children every morning before the factory whistle. Not variety, not excitement. The same bowl, the same flavor, the same warm kitchen every day. In a city and a life full of uncertainty, that sameness was a gift worth more than anything it cost. There is something that needs to be said about what these grandmothers understood that we have forgotten. They understood that breakfast was not about pleasure. It was about function. It was fuel for people whose bodies were their only tool, whose work was physical, whose days demanded everything from them before noon. Every breakfast on this list was engineered without any formal knowledge of nutrition, without any laboratory, without any of the resources modern food science takes for granted, to deliver maximum energy and maximum satiety at minimum cost. The schmaltz delivered fat calories. The kasha delivered slow-burning carbohydrate. The congee delivered hydration and starch in the most digestible form possible. The jurek delivered protein and electrolytes for men sweating through brutal industrial labor. They figured all of this out by watching their husbands, by noticing which mornings the men came home with energy left and which mornings they came home hollow, by adjusting the recipe not to a formula but to a body, the specific body of the specific man who needed to function for the next 12 hours. That knowledge died when the body it served was no longer doing that kind of work, when the factory closed and the office opened and breakfast became a choice rather than a calculation, when there was enough money to buy something convenient and not enough memory to remember why the inconvenient thing was better. Number 6, Armenian matzoon and bread. In Armenian immigrant households in California, Massachusetts, and the small Armenian communities of the Midwest, matzoon, homemade fermented milk, thicker than yogurt, slightly sour, made by culturing warm milk with a spoonful of the previous batch, was the breakfast dairy that required no store, no money, only milk, and the living culture passed from one batch to the next. Matzoon spread on flat bread or lavish, or matzoon thinned with cold water into a drinking consistency and poured over torn bread in a bowl. The Armenian version of bread and milk soup, sour and cool and deeply refreshing on a summer morning. The culture that produced matzoon was treated by Armenian immigrant families the way a sourdough starter was treated by bakers, as something living, something irreplaceable, something that had to be maintained and fed and protected from cold and from carelessness. Some families traced their culture back generations, to mothers in Armenia who had maintained the same living colony of bacteria through migrations and wars and ocean crossings. When the grandmother died, and nobody in the family knew how to maintain the culture, the matzoon stopped. The flatbread continued for a while, then it stopped too. Within a generation, the breakfast had dissolved into the American morning. Orange juice, toast, coffee from a drip machine, and the culture that had crossed an ocean was gone. Number 5, Jewish oatmeal with schmaltz and onion. Not the sweet version, not the version with brown sugar and maple syrup that American breakfast culture eventually settled on. The Jewish immigrant version, savory oatmeal, cooked plain in salted water, topped with a spoonful of schmaltz and fried onion instead of butter and sugar. In Ashkenazi Jewish immigrant households in New York and Chicago and Philadelphia, sweet oatmeal in the morning was a luxury that used sugar that had other purposes. Savory oatmeal, topped with the same schmaltz that went on the bread, with onions fried until golden in the same fat, was filling in a completely different way than the sweet version. The fat and the savory flavor signaled to the body that it had received a real meal rather than a sweet one. The oats provided fiber and slow carbohydrate. The schmaltz provided fat calories. The onion provided flavor and the anti-inflammatory compounds that immigrant grandmothers had relied on for generations without knowing they were doing anything beyond making the oatmeal taste better. This breakfast lasted in immigrant households until the generation that grew up in America decided that oatmeal was supposed to be sweet. After that, the schmaltz jar was still on the shelf for other purposes, but the oatmeal was sweet, and the savory version was forgotten so completely that people who ate it as children sometimes wonder if they imagined it. They did not imagine it. It was real. It was better than they remember. Number 4, Mexican atole. In Mexican immigrant households in the Southwest and California, atole, cornmeal or masa flour cooked in water or milk with piloncillo, raw unrefined cane sugar, and cinnamon into a thick, warm drink that was as much a food as a beverage, was the breakfast that required almost nothing and produced something that sustained field workers through mornings of brutal physical labor, thick enough to eat with a spoon when freshly made, thin enough to drink from a cup when loosened with more water. Either way, it delivered calories, warmth, and the specific comfort of corn cooked with cinnamon and raw sugar, a combination so fundamental to Mexican food culture that it predated the arrival of any European ingredient. Mexican immigrant families in California in 1920 made atole every morning because it was cheap. Masa flour cost almost nothing, piloncillo was the cheapest sweetener available, cinnamon was bought in sticks that lasted for months. And because it was warm, and because it tasted like home on a morning when home was 500 miles away on the other side of a border that had recently been drawn through the middle of what used to be their country. The warmth of the atole, the smell of the cinnamon, the sweetness of the piloncillo. These things were not nutrition. They were continuity. They were proof that the morning was connected to every morning that had come before it, all the way back to a kitchen that no longer existed in a place that no longer felt like theirs. Number 3, Slovenian schmaltz. From a cloth sack carried across the Atlantic by a Slovenian grandmother who did not write down a single recipe because the recipe was in her hands, not on paper. Buckwheat flour, coarser than refined flour, darker, more strongly flavored, poured slowly into boiling salted water and stirred constantly until it formed a stiff, dry crumble rather than a smooth porridge. The technique was specific and required practice. Too much water, and it went gummy, too little, and it burned. The right amount, worked with the right motion, produced a dry, slightly nutty crumble, served in a bowl with cold milk poured over it, or with a spoonful of lard and crackling stirred through. Schmaltz was the breakfast of the Slovenian and Croatian immigrant communities in the steel towns of Pennsylvania and Ohio. It was dense, it was plain, it was filling beyond its size, and it tasted of buckwheat in a way that required no acquired taste. It was simply correct, in the way that food, eaten since childhood, is always simply correct. The last generation that made schmaltz from scratch in America made it in the 1970s and 1980s. Their children tried it once or twice and found it too plain, too unfamiliar, too far from anything the American breakfast had taught them to expect. The cloth sack that had crossed the Atlantic was empty by then anyway, and the hands that knew the technique were gone. What was lost when that knowledge stopped was not a recipe. A recipe can be written down. What was lost was the judgment, the specific understanding of how the crumble should feel under the spoon, how the water should sound when the flour hits it, how the kitchen should smell when it is almost done. That judgment lived in hands. When the hands were gone, it was gone. Number 1, the breakfast that had no name. In every immigrant community in America, there was a breakfast that had no name because it did not need one. It was simply what you made when there was nothing specific to make. When the week had been hard and the pantry was low and morning had arrived anyway, as it always does, regardless of what you have to serve it. Leftover bread, whatever it was, fat from the jar, whatever kind, salt from the tin, hot water from the stove, sometimes an egg if one was available, sometimes nothing beyond the bread and the fat and the salt. It was the Irish mother's fried bread and the Italian grandmother's bread soup, and the Jewish family's schmaltz on rye, and the Polish household's casa manna when the semolina ran out and nothing else was ready. It was the breakfast assembled from what remained, served without apology, eaten without complaint, because the alternative was not eating, and not eating was not an option. Every immigrant grandmother in America knew this breakfast. None of them called it by the same name. All of them made it the same way, with whatever was there, with hands that knew how to make something from almost nothing, with the specific confidence of women who had been making something from almost nothing their entire lives. That confidence, that knowledge, that refusal to let an empty pantry mean an empty table. That is what vanished from America when the boxes and the packages replaced the jars and the skillets, not the recipes. Those can be reconstructed. What vanished was the certainty, the deep, unquestioned knowledge that you could always feed your family no matter what because you knew how. These 20 breakfasts were built on that certainty. Every one of them. The grandmothers who made them were not cooking from recipes. They were cooking from knowledge. And knowledge, unlike a recipe, cannot be reprinted on a box. The challenge, make one of these this week. The polenta with milk, coarse cornmeal, salted water, 40 minutes of stirring, cold milk poured over, costs less than 50 cents and teaches you something that no packaged breakfast ever will. Or make the kasha. Toast the buckwheat in a dry pan first. Smell what it becomes when the heat hits it. Understand why a family carried that grain across an ocean. Or simply take stale bread, pour hot water over it, add a drizzle of oil, and eat it before you have decided whether it is good or not. Give it the same chance the grandmothers gave it. Then come back and tell us what happened. Drop it in the comments. I want to know if the schmaltz on rye surprises you. I want to know if anyone's grandmother still makes congee before 6 in the morning. I want to know if the schmaltz crumble sounds impossible until someone who grew up on it explains it to you. Because these breakfasts are not gone. They are waiting. In old cookbooks nobody has opened, in the memories of people who are running out of time to share them, in the hands of grandmothers who still wake before the rest of the house, and make something from almost nothing the way they have always made something from almost nothing. The only thing required to bring them back is remembering that they existed. Now you remember.